Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay, interesting question. It's even more strange that Germany lost World War I because the Eastern Front completely collapsed with the Russian Revolution. And so you'd think that Germany fighting two fronts, difficult, but then now only having one front to fight, you'd think that would be a win for Germany, right? But obviously it didn't turn out that way. Let's find out. Imperial War Museum's great channel. Preemptive like. My name's Connor if you're new. Original link to the video, top of the description. Let's go. Hope everyone's doing well.
For the first in 1918, the Allies were preparing for the First World War's final showdown, the campaign that would take them into the heart of Germany. They expected the fighting to stretch well into 1919, but
guys, I'm getting cold and the fan's on me. Just let me move it quick. Ow. Sorry. I should have done that before starting. Let's go.
But they expected the fighting to stretch well into 1919, but they were wrong. This chart shows German morale during the First World War, according to the US Army. As you can see,
I'm sure this giant increase corresponds with the collapse of the Eastern Front because of the Russian Revolution.
1918 saw a catastrophic collapse in the German will to fight. As a result, German soldiers began shirking or surrendering en masse, while at home, mutiny turned to open rebellion. By November of 1918, the Great War was over. So, what caused this collapse? Why did German soldiers and citizens lose faith in a war that they were certain they could win just months before? To explore those questions, we'll utilise IWM's latest exhibition, War and the Mind, which tackles the psychological dimensions of warfare from 1914 to the present day.
Okay. Wars are not just a physical undertaking, they are a psychological battle. And in that psychological battle, you have to retain your own focus, your own enthusiasm for that final victory. And without morale, it is not possible to win a battle, let alone to win a war.
First, let's return to this chart. It was created by the US Army Psychological Subsection. Based on reports from agents and interviews with prisoners of war, it shows civilian morale alongside the German military position and food situation. Now, to uncover what happened in 1918, we first need to understand the preceding years of the war. As you can see, in 1914, a so-called war fever gripped parts of the German public. The initial declaration of war led to large gatherings in the streets, with many believing the conflict would be over by Christmas.
Wars are ultimately fought by groups, by a sense of us versus them. When populations are being encouraged to support a war, they need to be presented with causes that they find legitimate, that can be justified, and where there are causes that are considered so critical that violence appears to be the only answer.
This was certainly the case for Germany. A relatively new nation, she sought her place in the sun amongst the other colonial powers of...
Right, by the time World War I starts, Germany has only been a country for 43 years, right?
Europe. Sought her place in the sun amongst the other colonial powers of Europe. However, possessing fewer resources than their enemies, Germany knew they would struggle to win a long war. Instead, they planned for a quick victory, defeating the French with a flanking attack before turning their full attention on Russia. The offensive started well, and they made swift progress towards Paris. But eventually, the German advance was halted at the Battle of the Marne, and stalemate took hold stronghold on the Western Front. This static trench warfare was uniquely difficult for soldiers to cope with.
The First World War was fought on an industrial scale. This was titanic quantities of men and munitions.
Question, guys. What is it?
The first.
Why are the World War One? Why are there so many really short barrel World War One artillery equipment? You know, and why did it transfer more to just fully long barrel? There has to be a reason.
The First World War was fought on an industrial scale. This was titanic quantities of men and munitions. The psychological effect of particular weapons was a real issue for all soldiers. Certain weapons elicited particular fears. Behind me is a German trench mortar known as the Minenwerfer, and the way its shells tumbled through the air caused acute anxiety for the British troops on the ground. The psychological impact of trench warfare varied from fears, anxieties, sometimes the excitements of going into battle, but then also drudgery, boredom, waiting. This created a huge psychological pressure for soldiers who endured this conflict.
The following years saw extremely heavy casualties on all sides, characterised by the fighting at places like Verdun and the Somme. By the end of 1916, Germany had lost nearly 1 million men. On top of this, resentment began to grow over the differences in accommodation and nourishment enjoyed by officers compared to ordinary soldiers. According to one soldier, "We all know that we are being sacrificed for the interests of a clique. We fight for the Prussian Junker economy, the ruin of the German people." While another said, "Let us hope we can all eat out of one pot again, and there will be no more masters and slaves."
I'm sure more is going to be explained, but I haven't heard anything yet that wouldn't be mutual for all combatants, regardless of the side they're on. You know, so I'm curious of what was particular to the German morale that wasn't also in the French and English morale.
In the face of these stressful conditions, soldiers on all sides had to find their own ways of soothing their minds. For many, the answer was smoking.
Before anybody really understood the physical damage that they caused to health, cigarette smoking was of immense emotional comfort for all sides, who existed in a fog of cigarette smoke. We have this item, a Princess Mary gift box, which was effectively a donation from the nation headed up by Princess Mary, who believed that every soldier and sailor and airman in Britain's forces deserved a gift. And the gift of choice, tobacco and cigarettes.
In Germany, however, quality cigarettes were harder to come by. From the outset of the war, Britain had used its naval dominance to blockade German ports and prevent vital supplies from getting in. The subsequent shortage of tobacco caused the price of cigarettes to grow enormously, and tobacco was often mixed with other substances like cherry, chestnut and oak leaves to create substitute or ersatz cigarettes. But while some products could be substituted, the British blockade made feeding the German population extremely difficult. A series of poor harvests made the situation worse, while the black market began to stratify the population into those who could and could not afford to eat.
Interesting. So the British and French soldiers didn't lack the creature comforts that the Germans lacked. But sorry. The civilians of Germany had to suffer more hardship than the civilians of France or Britain, because those countries still had very open ports for trade.
The best, and to stratify the population into those who could and could not afford to eat the best food. All of this had a dire effect on German morale. As a result, German leaders began to take the public mood far more seriously. They instituted the so-called
Sorry guys, stay hydrated.
dire effect on German morale. As a result, German leaders began to take the public mood far more seriously. They instituted the so-called Hindenburg Program, which included a newfound focus on propaganda.
The propaganda machine isn't just there to persuade people, for example, volunteers to join up. It's also in evidence to persuade civilians to keep going, to keep taking the strain of wartime life. In this exhibition, we feature many posters from our collection which make clear those propaganda messages. Part of the effort to persuade civilians relies on dehumanizing the enemy, making out that they are so barbaric that you have to remain engaged in conflict. Make clear
Remember
those propaganda
Belgium?
messages. Part of the effort to persuade civilians relies on dehumanizing
Should you stand by while such things go on? Our brave soldiers at the front need your help.
the enemy, making
The Huns have desecrated and destroyed the cathedrals of France and Belgium.
that they are so barbaric that you have to remain engaged in conflict in order to defeat potentially a crisis of existence if the enemy is allowed to win.
Frustrated with stalemate and eager to strike back against the British blockade, Germany relaunched their campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917. They wanted to starve the British out of the war, but the main result was to make the blockade even more complete by provoking the United States to join the Allies in April 1917. German morale reached rock bottom. However, this setback was soon matched by better news.
Russians.
In November, Russia suffered a collapse of its own, exiting the war and accepting harsh conditions. This gave Germany one last chance to win the war before American manpower tipped the scales irrevocably in the Allies' favour. They planned to mobilise all their forces for an all-out offensive on the Western Front in 1918. But while German morale soared once more, the problems were hard to ignore. In January 1918, up to 1 million German workers, many of them from the vital armaments industry, went on strike. Only after an intervention from the army and conscription of some of the workers involved did the strike come to an end. There were problems too in Germany's newly acquired territories in the east. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Russia and subsequent bread peace with Ukraine should have provided the food that Germany needed, but these areas were now in turmoil and they required vast manpower just to police the food they supplied.
Well, it also, I mean, the Soviet, the Russian Revolution and the Brest-Litovsk collapse of a lot of Soviet area doesn't mean just Germany doesn't have to face their Eastern Front anymore. Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans don't have to, face up against the Russians. And so you'd think you could get some help from those allies of yours for things?
Should have provided the food that Germany needed, but these areas were now in turmoil and they required vast manpower just to police. The food they supplied was simply not enough to quell the hunger riots which began to break out in both Germany and Austria-Hungary.
Is that a horse?
At the front, Germany began to transfer soldiers from east to west, but up to 10% of the men used the transports to desert in 1917. The troops that did make it were then subjected to a massive Allied propaganda campaign.
Propaganda is weaponised on the battlefield during the First World War, particularly through the drop of leaflets, paper leaflets dropped by aircraft over the trenches. We have examples of some of the leaflets that have been dropped throughout different conflicts, including a bomb casing used in the First World War to drop those leaflets, to terrify, to demoralise, to make people believe that the cause that they're fighting for is no longer worthwhile.
The chance of winning the war was the only thing holding Germany together. On the 21st of March 1918, Germany's spring offensive, known as the Kaiserschlacht, began. Initially, the attacks were extremely successful, with new stormtrooper tactics resulting in unprecedented gains. But the German forces quickly outran their supplies and artillery, preventing them from converting these tactical breakthroughs into a strategic victory. The losses, meanwhile, were staggering. By April 10th, 300...
Did they try to do a similar encirclement here? Kind of like the Dunkirk encirclement? Were they just not able to close this gap here?
The losses, meanwhile, were staggering.
Clearly not. I'm just also wondering if they just didn't prioritize that.
By April 10th, 300,000 men had been killed, wounded, or captured, with the losses concentrated among the best units. The Germans continued to attack, but saw diminishing returns. Then, the Allies counterattacked. First at the Marne in July, and then at Amiens in August. This marked the beginning of the 100 Days Offensive, a continuous Allied attack across multiple parts of the front. The Allies now possessed a huge advantage, not only in men, but machines. They had more artillery, aircraft, and tanks than their enemy, and they were pioneering combined arms warfare, a doctrine which is still in use today. The Allies advanced at a steady pace, and Germany's chance to win the war was gone.
Probably the most critical psychological driver underpinning all conflicts is that both sides, all sides, believe that they can win. When that purpose, that motivation goes, then it is simply not possible to wage war. The psychological dimensions of conflict are so critical, and when they start to disappear, when the belief that this is purposeful erodes, then it is impossible. Psychology makes it impossible to continue to wage war.
On top of all this, 1918 saw one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, known as the Spanish flu. The first wave had hit in spring and helped to derail the German offensive, while the second, more lethal wave arrived in autumn, just as the Allies were winning the upper hand. The disease affected all sides, but for Germany it was part of a perfect storm. The failure of the spring offensive unleashed all the anger and bitterness that had been building for the previous 3 years of war. The starvation, death and destruction joined with the realization that the war was well and truly lost.
So we know how damaging and incredibly damaging the Treaty of Versailles is for Germany. And that's something that I can see for a completely defeated enemy. Like, you go and you take Berlin, it's unconditional, you lost. But it wasn't that. It was a war that was stopped and Germany capitulated, and yet they still faced that and crippling Treaty of Versailles. And I'm wondering if that was known to have been coming, if the Germans would surrender. Does that make sense?
Subsequently, German morale plummeted on both the home and fighting fronts. From mid-July to the war's end, some 340,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, in many cases with minimal resistance.
When people lose the will to fight, or they find themselves in circumstances where it is just simply not possible to continue, they may surrender. In War in the Mind, we have an example of a pocket watch which was taken from a German soldier as he surrendered to a British soldier. The British soldier later recounted the encounter and how they had shared a cigarette before he took the pocket watch, which was considered to be normal behaviour, taking items from prisoners. When surrender takes place to such an extent that it weakens a fighting force, as it did in the First World War to Germany en masse, it is no longer possible to wage war.
It wasn't just surrender. Up to 1 million German soldiers began to shirk their service in the final months of the war. When officers tried to rally retreating troops, they were met with cries of "You're prolonging the war," while reserves moving to the front were labelled strikebreakers. The German army became a shadow of its former self, and the front was reduced to a so-called spider's web of fighters. The Allies were expecting the fighting to go on. Instead, the collapse of German morale on both the home and fighting fronts brought the war to a premature end. On the 29th of September, German commander Erich Ludendorff finally admitted to Kaiser Wilhelm II that the war was indeed lost, saying the German army has reached the end. The troops can no longer be relied on. Soon, the other Central Powers began to drop out. First Bulgaria in September, then the Ottomans in October, and finally the Austro-Hungarians on the 3rd of November. That same day, German sailors who had been ordered to sail out for a final suicidal attack against the Royal Navy began a mutiny. Soon, rebellions began to spread across Germany, eventually forcing the Kaiser's abdication. Armistice negotiations soon followed and were finally agreed on the 11th of November 1918. Alongside helping to end the war, the collapse of German morale had more lasting effects. It fueled the so-called stab-in-the-back myth, which the Nazis exploited on their rise to power. Meanwhile, the desire to avoid a repeat helped to lengthen the Second World War, in which Nazi Germany fought on until the very end. There are few more powerful examples of the importance of the psychological dimension of conflict.
It's a great video. I also wonder why, you know, I believe Hitler said in the Second World War that he sees Americans as essentially not fighters, you know, and too used to like luxuries and things, and essentially calling them just not fighters, right? But in the First World War, you saw how Americans eventually coming into the war because of unrestricted submarine warfare by the Germans. You would think that that would cause Adolf Hitler to be more cautious in provoking the Americans to also come over and join. Americans famously joining both World Wars in the later stages, right? So that's interesting. This makes me really wonder how, after a country that kind of gave up and capitulated, to also receive such a debilitating treaty that harmed the country so much. I wondered why. Of course, this was seen as like the war to end all wars, and then World War II was also claimed to be that. But I wonder why the Allies thought it so necessary to punish the Germans so much, even though they didn't stop to the last man and they just said, all right, it's over. Which I think is also interesting. Great video. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. You guys are always awesome down in the comments. And I hope I'll see you guys next time. We'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.